That was absolutely beautiful. I want to say to you how glad I am to be with you today, and I want to thank all of you hardy folks for being out. Now tonight, there really is no excuse not to be here for the teaching session because the temperature, as I understand, is going to be up to 21 degrees this afternoon. So all of us will be here in t-shirts and shorts tonight. But it is good to be with you. Alan, your pastor, is such a great friend. I think he's doing some religious work, he and his family, taking a little bit of a vacation, which every minister should do. And I'm grateful that he invited me. You have such a warm and wonderful staff and group of people here at the church. I couldn't feel more welcome when I come to a church, and I'm so grateful for the warmth and for the fellowship of this church. Thank you so much. This morning, the reading is from Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus. Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 12. When I was a teenager, our pastor would give the invitation. The best I can remember, he would say something like this at the invitation. This is the time for those of you who want to accept Jesus Christ into your life to be baptized. The time for those of you who want to join this church. This is the time for you to come. And then our pastor would also say something like this, directed to the young people. For all of you who want to commit your life to full-time Christian service, this is the time for you to come. What he meant by that was that if you felt called to be a pastor, you felt called to be a missionary, you felt called to be a minister of music, this was the time that you came in front of the church to say to the church, I feel called by God to be a pastor. I never will forget the morning that I walked to the front of the church and I took my pastor's hand and I said to him, I believe that God is calling me to be a pastor. I was 15 years old. I had little understanding of what it meant to be a preacher or a pastor. But somewhere in the depths of my life, I felt that God was calling me to preach the gospel. Do you know what my pastor said to me? He said, if you feel called to do something, then you ought to do it immediately. I had never been to seminary, obviously. I didn't know anything about how to put together a sermon. And my pastor was saying to me, you need to get started in your preaching. And so I started. A few unsuspecting churches invited me. Just one time, as I remember, never invited me at the second time. I went to the Dade County Correctional Center and still remember the clanging of the door behind me as it locked, and I stood there in front of these grizzled men and preached the gospel to them. But the experience I remember the most was going to what was called the Miami Rescue Mission. Every Thursday night, men off the street coming in, and the idea was that if they came in, they would get a soup and sandwich and a bed to sleep. Do you know what they didn't know? They had to listen to my sermon before they had the soup and the sandwich and the bed. The second time that I preached at the Miami Rescue Mission, I was about 3 minutes into the sermon when a fairly young man on the second row raised his hand to ask a question. Now, folks, nobody ever told me what to do if somebody has a question during the sermon. In fact, I want to say to you this morning that if you don't understand this sermon at all and you have lots of questions, I don't want to see your hands. You're not supposed to ask questions during the sermon. What you do is you go home and over lunch you start talking to each other and you say to each other, "We didn't understand a thing that he said this morning, but don't call me." This is a sermon and you don't ask questions. He had his hand up though. What was I going to do? What I started doing was I started raising my voice. I thought to myself, if I talk louder, he's going to put his hand down and he won't ask the question. The problem was that the louder I got, the more he raised his hand, and finally I had to stop and I said, "You have a question?" And I will never forget, as a 15-year-old boy, this man off the streets looked at me and he said, "My question is this: who are you to come here to tell me how to live my life?" Folks, I have never forgotten that question. I know something of what he meant. Who are you? You're 15 years old. You don't understand anything about the experience of what it is to live on the street, to be captive to alcohol. You don't understand anything about what we're experiencing in our lives. Who are you to come here to tell us how to live? I don't know what I said to him. I don't know what I answered. I'm sure it wasn't very profound, because I really didn't have an answer. All through my ministry, almost 60 years later, I have never forgotten that question, and every time I come to a group of people, I remember that. Who am I to speak to anybody's concerns? You and I are gathered here this morning, and we probably don't know each other at any depth. But I suspect we've gathered here with our joys and our fears, our hurts and our disillusionments. We've gathered here wondering about a child that has gone somewhere and we don't know where that child is. We're concerned about something that is going on in a relationship in our lives. All kinds of things just twisting in and out of the congregation. You and I have come here this morning, and we've come because somehow we need a word from God. Who am I? That was the question that Paul was struggling with in the 3rd chapter of Ephesus. Remember, Paul wasn't sitting at a desk dipping his pen into ink and writing a letter. Paul was a captive in Rome. He was chained. He was under house arrest. He was dictating the letter to somebody else. Paul was suffering for the sake of the gospel. But Paul was asking the question, Who am I? Who am I to speak to the pain and the problems of your life? Do you know what he discovered? He discovered that in himself, he wasn't adequate to speak to those pains and problems. What he discovered was, in these words from Ephesus so powerful, that he was a servant that was called by God. And he says, first of all, I want you to know that the words I write to you, the words that I speak to you, the words that I share with you, the words that I try to tell you about God, all of those words come as a gift from the grace of God. Paul was a Jew. Paul was a Pharisee. Paul obeyed the law of God. But Paul was called to be a missionary to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. And he wrote to them and he said that throughout the history of the Old Testament, the grace of God has only gone to those who are Jews. But now in the mystery of God, something has broken open and God has called me to be the missionary to the non-Jews. He said to them, do you know what? The gift has come. The door is open. The door is grace. The way that you and I come to God is not by earning it, not by being good enough, but the way we come to God is that God opens the door, and it is a gift. How many times have I preached and thought to myself, I'm talking to myself and I'm talking to others who feel like that somehow we have to be good enough. That we look at the past of our lives and we see the things that we've done, or we see the things that we've said, or we've seen the things that we've communicated to people, or we've seen the things that we've not done in our lives. And we say to ourselves, how in the world can God love us? And I want to tell you how.